The Vanderbilts, the Kennedys, the Bushes, each are considered family dynasties. Author Andrew Meier now adds another family to that distinguished roster in his biography, Morgenthau, Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty. The longtime journalist and author of 3 previous nonfiction books admits that beyond New York, few Americans are familiar with the Morgenthau name.
It's really kind of extraordinary that they're not better known, because they were right there next to Woodrow Wilson, right next to FDR and Mrs. Roosevelt, arguably the most important figure in the history of American women.
Meier chronicles how over 4 generations, the Morgenthaus made their fortune in Manhattan real estate, advised presidents, exposed the Armenian genocide, and from their wealth, built a dynasty of public service, particularly in America's criminal justice system.
I have proof.
In fact, Robert Morgenthau was the inspiration behind the popular TV series Law and Order. Known to New Yorkers as The Boss and DA for life, he was the longest tenured district attorney in the history of New York City, serving for 4 decades. Morgenthau oversaw controversial prosecutions, from the war on the mafia to the infamous Central Park jogger case.
Dip into the Kennedy years and you'll learn about Robert Morgenthau was with Bobby Kennedy the day that his brother Jack was shot in Dallas. That is untold history, and many people are fascinated by that. Or if you're interested in the New Deal, Henry Morgenthau Jr. was Secretary of Treasury for almost 12 years, one of our longest serving cabinet members in history. Did not have a college degree, failed out, as you know, from prep school. Roosevelt's very, very close friend.
With unprecedented access to family archives, Meier spent more than a decade researching and conducting interviews to share the epic saga of the Morgenthaus. Andrew Meier, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Now, I know that you have said before that this is a labor of love. I'm curious about how long it took you to not only research it, but actually write it.
All told, really, if you look at it, at least 8 years. It's a very long book. I really say this, and I'm not joking, dip in wherever you want. If you're interested in, and we'll talk about this, I hope, but briefly, if you're interested in the Kennedy years, dip into the Kennedy years, and you'll learn about Robert Morgenthau was with Bobby Kennedy the day that his brother Jack was shot in Dallas. That is untold history, and many people are fascinated by that. Or if you're interested in the New Deal, Henry Morgenthau Jr. was Secretary of Treasury for almost 12 years, one of our longest serving cabinet members in history. Did not have a college degree, failed out, as you know, from prep school. Roosevelt's very, very close friend.
He called him what? Henry the Morgue? What did he call him? Henry the Morgue?
Henry the Morgue. They had this really bizarre and kind of warm bromance, very warm. Henry Morgenthau was really, I think, deeply misunderstood. I knew very little about him. I knew about sort of the Morgenthau plan, his idea for Germany after the war, and I knew that he had been Secretary of the Treasury. I didn't know more than that 10 years ago. And that's really the heart of the book, the relationship between the Roosevelts, Mrs. Roosevelt, and Henry's wife, Eleanor. They were the only couple that they really were close to and socialized with. You know, the Roosevelts had a pretty complicated political marriage, probably the most complex in American history. And they were close, both the wives and the men, very close. And Henry was with FDR the night before he died. So if you're interested in that.
You were the first to know about his ailment, correct?
That's
it
right.
was kept secret as best they could back then, and which was easier than today, for sure. But
right.
Did I read that he
absolutely right, and that's something that I didn't know, the intimacy that they had. You know, as you said, he was known. FDR liked to kid him and tease him. You know, you're Henry the Morgue, and there are hundreds of books, obviously, about Roosevelt, thousands. And Henry Morgenthau is often the kind of glum stooge who does everything for Roosevelt, from devising these extraordinary budgets during the New Deal, but also literally fetching his liquor during Prohibition, which he did. And Henry Morgenthau, the real estate, then he was flush with money. He owned a lot of northern Manhattan. He had already put together Times Square. He physically cobbled together what's now known as Times Square. At one point, he owned the Plaza Hotel. He built much of Wall Street.
That was one of my questions. Outside of New York City and New York State, I'm sure people are going to, who are the Morgenthaus? I'm guessing much of the country, the rest of America, knows very little, thus this book. You gave us a little bit glimpse into their power of this family and their role in public service.
Most New Yorkers, as you say, absolutely right, know the name, know something about the name. They certainly knew about the DA. A lot of Americans know Law and Order, the TV show that he inspired. The DA was a central inspiration to that, the show and all the shows that it spawned. And in Washington, people know, but across the country, people don't know. And what I find so fascinating and really rewarding is that what other American family, and this is as I was researching and digging, it occurred to me, what other American family had across at least 3 generations, leaving aside Lazarus, as you say, was part inventor, part gambler, and at least one part con man, and ends up alone, destitute, in a room.
Right.
Yeah, and not quite right. And the movie may be just about Lazarus in the 19th century, the part that I thought was like most remote. That may be the most blockbuster story because, as you said, it's rags to riches, back to rags for him. Right. But out of that comes this dynasty of at least 3 generations, and they're still going strong, that Americans don't really know. And, other than the Adams, 2 presidents, the Adams, the Bushes, yeah, but that's 2 generations, not 3. And it's really kind of extraordinary that they're not better known. And, I think that the early response to the book shows just that. Yeah, people are like, wait, what is that family, or who is that, or how do you pronounce that? And wait a minute, how could we not have known? Because they were right there next to Woodrow Wilson, right next to FDR and Mrs. Roosevelt, arguably the most important figure in American the history of American women, not just the 20th century, but probably even today, and then the Kennedys, and Bob Morgenthau, the DA. He met every single president since Calvin Coolidge, when I think he was 7 years old. So they were at the edges of the highest levels of power in America for 100 years. It's kind of astounding that they weren't better known, that they aren't better known.
He was the longest serving district attorney in the history of New York City, and later became known as the boss, and that was under when he was under the work for the feds.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah. He was.
He invented the modern federal prosecutor role. Is that correct?
Yeah. He was known as the boss. He was known, when I got to know him, he was 89 years old, and he was going to run again for a 9th term. He had already, he was going to run for a 10th term, as DA of Manhattan. And he had a slogan. Victoria, his slogan was 90 in '09. And I actually thought it was a pretty good political slogan. And everyone thought he would run, and he probably, almost certainly, would have won at 90 years old. And he was introduced always at events as DA and DA for life.
Were you granted unrestricted access to these diaries and correspondence? Because the diaries go back to the original Lazarus, who comes over and keeps the detailed accounts, and so does some of the other children. But as a journalist, did you feel like, Eureka, I found buried treasure?
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. It's not an authorized biography. I didn't get permission, but without his kind of silent blessing, I learned very quickly. There's no way I was getting near anything. Public archives I could have gotten to, but I went to a very quick story. I went to go see a judge. I interviewed many, many judges, federal judges, local judges, and right away they said, does the DA know, or does the boss know about this? And the phone call would come, it's okay. So it was that kind of a thing. It was hard to find people early on who were his critics. There weren't really many rivals. I sought out every critic I could find because, as you say, I am first and foremost a journalist. And as a biographer, I like to try to practice this thing which we call investigative nonfiction. So I'm not taking a side. I'm trying to find, ideally, the paper, the first documents, or the people who really have firsthand knowledge. So I was looking for critics, rivals, ex-politicians, judges, prison guards. I did, and I'm still probably doing it. As the book comes out and we're excerpting it, there was an excerpt recently in the New York Times, and people got in touch with me. I will talk to them. I will interview them, because it's all about trying to get as complete a picture and as accurate a picture as I can. And I think, really, to answer your question, that's what the DA liked. He didn't want a puff piece. He didn't want, a glorifying profile. He wasn't interested in a biography just of himself, interesting enough, because the ego was pretty big.
Yes.
The ego, and I hope that comes through, and the power was extraordinary.
So the fascinating part, I thought, from the very beginning is that Lazarus, again, the original, comes over, and he had he had 13 kids. I lost track. How many children?
14. His poor wife, Babette. 14 kids, and I think 23.
Babette, that's all I can say. I kept thinking, she was a strong woman. But that he kept this diary. So back then, so it starts with him, and then the first Henry, keeps a very detailed diary at a young age.
Henry Sr. kept everything. In both in the Library of Congress, which is one of our great national treasures, but also in the Franklin Roosevelt Library up in Hyde Park, New York, upstate. There are millions, and it's not an exaggeration. And he keeps ticket stubs. He keeps a page diary, a weekly diary, a monthly diary, what he spent every penny on, and how he earned every penny. Secret notes to himself about different girls in his class.
Yes, you talk about that. It's very detailed.
It's fascinating, but a bit of a nightmare for a biographer. And then you stumble upon quotes from Benjamin Franklin. And these are lessons to himself. And that was really unusual for a young German Jewish boy whose father is, as we talked about, kind of a little half mad, and in danger of, which happens, not to give it away, the cops come for him, and he loses everything, and he almost ends up in jail, family disgrace, everything. This young boy in New York City, as the city is rising, as the city is really becoming a modern metropolis, he falls in love with Ben Franklin. And for me, that was fascinating. And that is one of the through lines. That's one of the main themes, is whatever generation, Morgenthau, Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty. That's the long subtitle for a long book. But really, someone asked me the other day, what's the most important word in that subtitle? American. You talked about it. That's really the point that I was trying to bring home, is that this is an American family, and what it meant to be American. They didn't care about the dynasty, and that was certainly the ego runs through, and they wanted, longevity and legacy.
And you say that actually early on, and I might have been with Lazarus, the original, or one of the children, that was their goal, to be American. I remember reading that. And that's one thing, you do a great job at offering historical context into the story. Was that made simpler by the simple fact that you've just said here today, that the family's place in history, no matter what generation, seems to parallel big events?
Yeah, it's both a blessing and a burden, because when you're up against someone like Eleanor Roosevelt or someone like FDR, FDR just steals every scene. Or Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is at the family farm, and Bob, the future DA, is back from the war. He served both in the Mediterranean at 21, 22, 23 years old. He enlisted before Pearl Harbor as a junior in college. He really wanted to, as he said, he wanted to go fight the Nazis. And he's serving cocktails to Winston Churchill. You just have to pinch yourself. Is this possible? Is this true? And really, will Victoria and the rest of the readers believe this? Because, they are constantly on the stage with these political celebrities of the 20th century, again and again and again. And I ended up seeing where they fit in ways that they themselves might not have even seen. How important, for instance, the Treasury Secretary was to the New Deal, to arming Europe, again, before Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Morgenthau and Roosevelt, against American law, armed the French and the English, very much like what's going on in Ukraine today. So there are all these echoes.
How wealthy were they at one time? Okay, Lazarus, we said rags to riches, back to rags, but then there's his children and beyond. Were they back in I guess it's kind of the Gilded Age somewhat, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, were they at that level?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And actually the DA, Robert Morgenthau, it was one of the things that really stuck in his craw. He's like, we weren't that wealthy, we're not that wealthy. When he passed away, he left behind a goodly sized estate. And he used to sort of snarl at me, well, New York's an expensive town. And I've got a lot of kids, both of which, of course, are true. But it goes back to the Gilded Age. Lazarus comes over 1866, obviously the end of the Civil War. I got to avoid the Civil War, thank goodness. It's 150 years of history, but not the Civil War. He came over with some money. He had been extremely wealthy in Germany. He had been a cigar baron, 4 factories, 1,000 workers, one of the richest men in Mannheim, Germany. He owned this huge mansion, which still exists today. He lost it all because Lincoln, much like today, had slapped on these Civil War tariffs against any foreign goods, but especially tobacco. And so Lazarus' business sunk. But Henry, as I said, was a real estate magnate, made a fortune. He had more than $1 million as early as 1915, World War I, and when he's the ambassador to Turkey. He's already an extremely wealthy guy. He wasn't at the level of the Astors, who really controlled New York real estate, but he was the first to get John Jacob Astor, the famous Astor, patriarch, to sell, from what we know and from what the deeds show. He was the first to get John Jacob Astor to actually sell property. You see, you never sold property. You just held it. It was a nice monopoly. And certainly, so he had money. But they all married really well. To answer your question, it's not the Rothschilds, it's not the Whitneys. But certainly with Franklin Roosevelt, with the Roosevelts, Franklin Roosevelt didn't have a lot of money. They were the people he went to for a good time, for many reasons, the least of which being money. But they had the big farm where they could lay out a clam bake, for instance, whenever Franklin wanted to come down, because Eleanor Roosevelt hated cooking. Her cooking was horrific. And Roosevelt loved to eat, and he loved to entertain. And he could really, as you said, he could be himself around the Morgenthaus. They were very, very close.
It's interesting. So I'm going to fast forward to present day. Bob, the DA, for those, again, keep everybody straight, worked until he was 90, as was mentioned. But none of his 7 children, from what I read, have shown an interest in public life like he did in some of his relatives. What's your take on the Morgenthau dynasty then? Does it end with Bob, the district attorney who just passed not too long ago?
Right. It's a great question. His oldest daughter, Jenny Morgenthau, for many, many years, decades, in fact, ran something called the Fresh Air Fund in New York City, which it's not a public office, but it's certainly public service to bring kids out of the city into literally fresh air in the summers. And his other children have done similar endeavors. His youngest son, Josh, now runs that family farm outside New York City. It's about an hour outside. And again, it's not public office, but I do think you could call it a kind of public service. Certainly the locals, and a lot of people come from New York for the big fall festivals, pumpkin picking, etc. And it's all organic, and they make their own Treasury cider now. Good plug for his Treasury, delicious Treasury cider. But the DA's older brother, Henry, who I mentioned, passed away at 101. He was involved in public television for most of his life, was really a pioneer of public television. his daughter, Sarah Morgenthau, actually did just run for Congress. So she certainly continues and has aspirations and hopes to continue for elective office.
It reads like a novel. It really does. I mean, they're fascinating people in and of their own right, even Henry the Morg. And so, yeah, it's the way you describe them. So having all those details, and I know it was tedious, but no question it's paid off in this long run. So congratulations. It's a heck of a read. I'm anxious for my husband to read it too, but he definitely loves biographies. And I said, you're going to love this. And again, a family I just never heard of. And I thought, am I the only one that's like this? So I like to think I'm educated.
You're not. And as a friend of mine likes to say, no, you haven't heard of them yet, but you will. And it's not really, it's really, as you brought out, it's really a story about America. It's really a story about the great immigrant story and kind of the hope and promise of what it means to be an American. It sounds cliche, it sounds corny, but that's really at the heart of what they stood for and what they tried to achieve. And I hope that comes through.
Sure. Well, the book, again, is Morgenthau, Power, Privilege, and the Rise of an American Dynasty. Andrew Meier, thank you so much for all the work and for entertaining us, too, with a really terrific read. Thank you so much.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much, Victoria.